Hello there, everybody. It is Tuesday night, and we go live every Tuesday night on the Holy Politician podcast. So I hope you are having a wonderful week. Tonight, we're going to talk about really what God is saying about the election 2024 exit poll data. So if you haven't read it, I'm going to share some of those data tonight with you. You can find it anywhere by Googling it and read through all of the different data points. But I want to talk about some of the data points that I think are most interesting and really most relevant for this platform and for the things that I think are most germane right now. Um, there are a lot of questions that were not asked as part of that exit poll data that probably should have and could have been asked, but they weren't. And that's another conversation for another day, perhaps, if Pew Research does a more intensive deep dive. But the purpose of the Holy Politician platform really is to give all of us an opportunity to check our judgments, to scrutinize everything that we do as it relates to policy and policy through the lens of the gospel. And so that's for every last one of us. I want to do my due diligence to hold myself accountable for scrutinizing things through the lens of truth as it concerns every aspect and facet of society. The Bible says that we are in this world, but not of this world. So our actions, our conversations, our demeanor should constantly be reflecting that. And if we are dying daily, and if we are growing in our maturity level with Christ, then we'll learn and understand that our perspective changes the more we become like Christ. We will start to look more like Christ and sound more like Christ and act more like Christ. And we don't see that happening all the time with people that profess the name of Jesus. And we have a lot of people wearing blinders still. And all of us have blinders. Every last one of us have blind spots. Nobody has arrived at this place of being all knowing because only Jesus was perfect in the earth. And so this is an opportunity for us all to hold ourselves accountable and to check our assumptions, to think very biblically when it pertains to any decision that we're making in life. And so, what is God saying about the election 2024 exit poll data? Well, before I get into that, if you haven't yet subscribed to the Holy Politician on YouTube, I would encourage you to do that. You can go over to YouTube if you're not on YouTube right now and look up the Holy Politician and press subscribe. I've been going live since before the general election, so there's a lot of content and conversation in there about a host of things as it relates to politics and policy. As a former federal lobbyist, that often found myself really asking questions about how federal policy was made. Um, these topics are really important to me, and they should be important to everybody, but because it affects your everyday life. And as Christians, we should be active in policy, and yes, even active in politics, because we have to live under a certain set of rules that come out of laws that are passed at the local level, at the state level, and at the federal level. And if all you're doing is just sitting by and just allowing life and law to happen to you, then you are not an active participant in society. God wants us all to be active and to be engaged in how our lives take shape every day. At the end of the day, the laws that are put in place today are going to affect our children and our children's children tomorrow. What kind of society do you want them to live in? And so we have to be active and we have to be engaged and we have to use our voice, and we absolutely must sound the alarm when there are things taking place that are outside of morality, outside of the gospel, outside of truth. Even people that are non believers can deduce and identify truth, believe it or not. And sometimes it looks like the believers are being more duped than the unbelievers. And so the election 2024 exit poll data really reveal what we've known really for a while about the way that America shows up in society in the way that different groups view politics and policy. And so one of the first data points that I want to talk about from the exit poll data, and the exit poll data is basically there are people that are surveyed the day of the election. Some of them are surveyed in person, some of them are surveyed over the phone, some of them are surveyed via text message. But these are data that are gathered from thousands and thousands of Americans that are considered to be a representation of America and how America voted on election day. And so these data are gathered on that day, the day of the election. And so the first point that I wanted to talk about is what the data reveal is the more uneducated you are, quote, uneducated you are, the more you're likely to vote Republican. Now, I don't know if this surprises people, but 63% of all voters who never attended college were Republican voters. And so that's more than half of those that cast their vote were uneducated and they voted for Republicans. The most educated voters are non white and liberal. And we can use the term educated loosely today, but what that means is the people that are more likely to graduate from college, have a college degree, and even high school diploma are most likely to be non white and most likely to vote Democrat. And so, there's lots of talk about what the education system has become, that it's become an education system that is not necessarily teaching what's true, or they're force feeding people doctrine that has often been compromised. And so we have to really think about what is the education system teaching us? What is it teaching our kids? What is it teaching our grandchildren? And so we don't know it when we enroll oftentimes in higher education, but many universities are pushing an agenda that's anti-God. It's pro-science, not that there's anything wrong with science, but when science is anti-God, then that becomes a problem. They're pushing an agenda that's anti-life and then pro this new age diversity. And so when I say what is God saying about exit poll data, what is being revealed when we look at data points like the majority of uneducated voters voted Republican? What is that saying about our education system? What is it saying about even the way that we define what it means to be an educated voter? Right? Is this education through the world's lens? Is it spiritual intelligence? Is it natural intelligence? What do we mean by this word educated? The next data point reveals that Generation X, which is my generation, were more likely to vote Republican than other generations in this last election. And so 54% of people between the ages of 45 and 64 voted Republican, compared with only 49% of my parents' generation, which is the baby boomer generation. And so there were more people from Generation X than from the baby boomer generation that voted for the Republican Party. And the generation most likely to vote Democrat is my children's generation, Generation Z. And so Generation Z voted Democrat at 54%, which is the same percentage of Gen X that voted Republican. And so these are interesting data, right? People between the ages of 45 and 64 were more likely to vote Republican, when people between the ages of, I believe, 19 to 25 or 26 were more likely to vote Democrat. Young women among Gen Z are strongly voting Democrat. So young women in my children's generation are voting Democrat at 61%. And so these are interesting data when you look across the generations to see how different generations are leaning when it comes to specific policies that they want to see show up at the local level, the state level, and the federal level. And you can look at the generations cut across by race if you look at the exit poll data, if you want to see how each generation voted within a particular racial group. And those data are even more revealing. So, on the topic of race, the majority of voters in the last election were white. 71% of voters in the past general election were white. And that's an overrepresentation of white voters because right now, according to US Census data, only 58% of America is white. And so that's an overrepresentation of what, 12%, 13%, or something like that. The majority of whites voted Republican at 57%. And then 12% of voters were Hispanic, which is an underrepresentation of the Hispanic vote because Hispanics represent 20% of the American populace. 11% of voters were Black. That's an underrepresentation of the Black populace. Blacks are 14% of America. 3% of voters were Asian. That is an underrepresentation for Asians. They're 6% of the United States. And then 1% of those that voted were American Indian or indigenous. And that's comparable with the indigenous community in the United States. And so all of these groups, except white people and indigenous people, voted Democrat. So all of the groups that I just mentioned, Hispanics, Blacks, and Asians, were more likely to vote for a Democratic candidate for Democratic policies than the natives of America and then white people. Black people voted overwhelmingly Democrat at 85%. And then 91% of Black women voted Democrat, while 45% of white women did. And so these are data, again, that probably don't surprise people that follow elections, that follow politics, that follow, what happens every 4 years and every 2 years when people head to the polls. There has been a lot of talk and consternation in the Black Democratic community about the way that these data reflect on society. And I've heard a lot of talk about, well, Black women, it's not Black women's fault that Kamala didn't win. It's the white woman's fault, or it's the white man's fault. And if we're looking at the way that people vote, in that if we're casting it in that light, then we're continuing to divide America. We're continuing to have silos and these isolation groups, or people that maybe do vote for the opposite party, for the Republican Party, become even more isolated, right? And so if we are levying a tax against a specific group because of the way that we vote, how does that help people to think critically about the way that they're going to vote next time, or the way that they will admit that they voted next time? And so we need to be careful about casting judgment and blame against a group of people just because of the way that they chose to cast their vote. People need to vote according to their convictions. And if you are a person who confesses the faith of Christians, if you are somebody that stands and represents Jesus, then you should be voting according to a biblical conviction, and a conviction that's based on truth. And so a few other statistics that I wanted to share is you are more likely to vote Democrat if you were Jewish. 78% of Jewish people cast their vote for Democrats. And that to me is interesting. If you're someone of the Jewish faith, that you overwhelmingly vote Democrat at nearly 80%. You are more likely to vote Republican if you were Protestant, Christian, or Catholic. Married men and married women were both more likely to vote Republican at more than 50%. 60% of married men voted Republican. Unmarried women voted Democrat at 59%. What I thought was interesting about people that served in the military or currently serve in the military is 65% of all US military men and women voted Republican. 65%. So 2/3 of everyone in the military cast their vote for the Republican policy platform, for the Republican candidate. The vast majority of Democrats seem to believe that the economy is good or excellent, according to the exit poll data, while the vast majority of Republicans believe that the economy is poor. And so it seems to me, based on these data, that we're living in two different worlds. We're living in two different economies. One group of people think that the economy is good. They think that we need policies that reflect, you know, supporting the immigrant community, the illegal immigrant community to be here to provide resources and support for them, and all the other things on the Democratic Party platform, when almost half of America believes the opposite. To some extent, everybody doesn't agree with each of all the policies on either side, but it really does appear that we're living in two different worlds, particularly when you see that inflation is absolutely has skyrocketed. And when you see that pay has not kept pace with inflation, it hasn't kept pace with the cost of living. But the vast majority of people that voted Democrat believe that the economy is good or excellent. When a lot of these people are struggling on their jobs or struggling and they're living from paycheck to paycheck. So I'm not sure what kind of economy they're living in. And so I thought that that was interesting. On the issue of abortion, 74% of Democrats said that was the most important issue, right under the state of the democracy at 80%. And so I don't really find that interesting that 74% of Democrats said that abortion was one of the most important issues in this campaign, because that really is what the Kamala Harris campaign built their entire platform on: reproductive justice and reproductive rights. But for that to be one of the most important issues blows me away, because really there are so many more pressing issues than that. There are so many more pressing issues than reproductive justice, unless you are fighting on it on behalf of reproductive rights on the opposite side, meaning you are working to prevent abortion. You're working to stop the mandate that companies are required to provide things like the day after pill. But the fact that 74% of Democrats thought that that was the most important election issue means that a lot of people are being duped and blindsided by what's truly important in our democracy. But they were very effective with their campaigns locally, at the state level, even in Florida. The vast amount of commercials that I saw talking about how Sally was basically violated, therefore we should vote for abortions, when only 1% or fewer of people actually need an abortion because of incest or rape. And so we need to be very mindful of the propaganda that we're fed every day. Can't tell you how many people sit in front of the tube and watch the news during the election, leading up to the election, after the election, and how that's feeding the way that we make decisions. The most important issues for Republicans was immigration and the economy. Immigration was highly important at 90%, and the economy at 80%. Respondents in both parties overwhelmingly said that they'd be scared if the opposing candidate won the election, which, God has not given us a spirit of fear, but of power and love and a sound mind. And in the last week's podcast, I talked about the furor that people felt because of the election results. And so there's a lot of fear, and a lot of that fear is coming from what we see and what we hear on TV, because people are casting fear on both sides. And if you don't have a strong relationship or a strong foundation, then I can understand why you would be afraid, because a lot of the lies that are being told about what will happen if Donald Trump becomes president, about what will happen if Kamala Harris became president, right? And so even though we're in the world, we're not of it, right? So even if the Kamala Harris won this past election, should we let fear drive our decision making, or drive the way that we show up the next day at work, or the next day for our families, or what comes out of our mouths even during certain conversations? I think that we should not allow fear to guide any decision we make. We should allow truth. We should allow anger, meaning anger at the spirit world for what is taking place in our society. When we allow children to be mutilated right before our eyes and we do nothing and say nothing. And so we need to be very mindful about the way that we are allowing our soul to guide the way that we respond. myself included. I found this last statistic to be very interesting. And this last statistic is just it's kind of mind-blowing to me, but maybe not so much. The majority of Democratic voters cast their ballot not because they were voting for Kamala, but because they were voting against Trump at 60%. 60% of those that said that they voted Democrat because they were voting against the opposing candidate. So that says a lot. That says a lot about people's fear of Donald Trump. That says a lot about how effective Democrats were at labeling him as a racist, as somebody that was going to destroy democracy, as somebody that, is sexist, doesn't care about women, as somebody who, violated the criminal justice system and got away with murder and got away with all these other things. But that says a lot about how people maybe didn't want to support the Democratic Party platform or want to support the Democratic candidate in Kamala Harris, who really didn't earn the vote of the Democratic Party initially to even be on the ticket in the first place. But it says a lot about how people will make decisions just because of what somebody said about a person. And so even though we spend a lot of time talking about how we should be voting for the policy and not the personality, the vast majority of people truly cast their ballots for the personality. And so it's so important for us to be well read. It's so important for us to be diligent in understanding what's taking place at the local level, in our counties and our cities, what's taking place at the state level, and what's taking place at the federal level, so that when these personalities show up on the scene in the next 3 years and say that they're running for president, when they show up on the scene next year and say that they're running for governor or that they're running for, a seat in the United States House or a seat in the United States Senate, or they're running for county commissioner or whatever, we need to know in advance what policies these people are supporting so that we're looking past their personality and we see the policy that they endorse. You can Google 2024 election exit poll data if you want to read up more on the election poll data, if you want to learn more about how people voted, not necessarily maybe why they voted the way that they voted. Some of those questions are in there as well. But if you want to be educated on these issues, you can Google it. ABC has these data. A lot of Bloomberg has these data. You can look at both sides of the spectrum, conservative and liberal, and you can find these data there. And just continue to study the issues. Pray for our country. We have a president that is going to be taking the oath of office in 2 months. And so pray for the safety of all of our elected officials. Pray for the safety of this new president. Pray for wisdom and discernment in Congress. Pray for wisdom at the state level in your state Supreme Courts, on appellate courts, on all kinds of courts all throughout the country, so that we see justice, true justice, and righteousness in America, because our children and our children's children need it. So I pray that you are further educated and enlightened from today. And if you have not subscribed to The Holy Politician, I would encourage you to do that. Share this video and encourage healthy dialogue and healthy debate. And yes, stay in prayer. Always stay in prayer. God bless you.